Primers are one of your other key components. Obviously, they're one of the four items you need to assemble a cartridge. And this is a fairly easy area to cover. There's a couple of do's and don'ts. First of all, primers come generally in four sizes. There is a small rifle, small pistol, large pistol. They're not interchangeable, although you can try to fit a small pistol primer in a small rifle primer pocket on a case. It's not the right thing to do. Use the right primer for the right application. Also, there are Magnum versions of these. You do not want to substitute a Magnum for a standard power primer. You want to use the correct one for the actual load data that you've obtained from multiple manuals per our manual video. So you don't have to worry about small or large in rifle or small or large in handgun because they simply won't fit. You will crush and potentially ignite the primer putting it in the primer pocket, so that's obviously not a good idea. But also don't substitute a standard for Magnum unless you are substantially further down the road and you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Don't do it just for fun. Reloading is not a hobby where you want to learn from your mistakes. Mistakes can be relatively serious. Primers are one of the areas where you're going to probably have to substitute components, even though that's kind of a cardinal rule not to break. You definitely don't want to substitute combinations of bullets and powders in particular load data, but especially if you're in the starting load range. And some very experienced reloaders claim that for almost any of their reloading, they feel relatively confident substituting brands of primer. However, they do ignite slightly differently. And so again, if I were going to substitute a primer, I would not have a problem doing that using one brand instead of another in a starting load. But if I had worked up a load that was a middle or high range load that was on the hot side, if I had to change primer, I would substantially back off, if not go all the way back down to the starting load and rebuild it. Not only just because of the safety factor, but because you may find with a slightly different ignition system that you actually wind up with a better combination at a slightly different place for your ultimate accuracy, which is one of your goals of working up a load anyway. So you can substitute brands with limitations, but I wouldn't do it in worked up loads. Unlike powders, primers are actually an explosive. Powders are an accelerant, even though when they are accelerating in a very tiny enclosed case, it's with an explosive force. The primer is an actual explosive. You want to be very careful handling primers for that reason, and they're packed very specifically for that reason. Primers will generally be in little cases like this. Let's zoom in so you can see this in more detail. It's going to come in a little flat box that's going to have the primers loaded in little trays. You can say most of them are one side up, a few of them are the other side around. When we get to the video on the actual priming process, we'll show you how to correct that. One of the do's and don'ts is you want to touch these as little as possible. The oils and stuff from your skin can affect the function of these and the longevity of them, so you want to have as little contact with them as possible. You want to keep them in their boxes for safety. In the early stages, you want to be priming cartridges one at a time, and you only want to have a limited number of primers out at any one time. As a matter of fact, kind of an interesting aside, they say if you're in an environment where people have multiple stations lined up where you have experienced reloaders that are doing really large volumes of reloading, they will generally have progressive presses or turret presses with hoppers on top. And one of the common ones is a hopper that consists of a long tube of primers so that they can very quickly prime cases in at least a semi-automated fashion. But the joke is if you look over top of the workstations, you'll see damage to the ceilings in the places of the more experienced reloaders, because inevitably at some point they will accidentally set off a primer, and if they've got a large tube of them in contact with each other, you generally get a chain reaction that sends an explosive force upwards and hopefully damages only the ceiling and not the rest of the equipment or the operator. But the moral of that story is you want to handle very few primers at once. You want to handle them very carefully. You want to touch them as little as possible. You always want to store them in their original containers, and obviously be aware of the fact that these are tiny explosives, so you don't want to be keeping huge quantities of these in any one place, especially without giving some thoughts in regards to overall safety and explosive hazard in the event of fire and that sort of thing. So obviously I wouldn't keep them in large quantities under my bed or in my bedroom. So that's it for primers. Don't substitute magnums for regular. If you do substitute brands, do it in starting loads and handle them very carefully.